Thank you so much for coming. My name is Grace Deveney. I am the David C. and Sarajean Ruttenberg Associate Curator of Photography and Media here at the Art Institute. And I'm thrilled to be on stage today with Kameelah Janan Rasheed. Kameelah has an exhibition up in the modern wing called Kameelah Janan Rasheed, Unsewn Time. And it's the 5th exhibition in the Ruttenberg Contemporary Photography series, a series that was designed to showcase emerging artistic voices working with photography. So we are thankful to the Ruttenberg family and foundation for their support of the exhibition. And I would also like to thank the Frank J. Mooney Memorial Fund. That fund has made this particular conversation possible. So I also, before getting into things, just want to thank all of my colleagues here across the museum for everything they've done to make this program happen and to make the exhibition possible. So thank you, Miguel, Ruby, Katie, Devontae, Zach, and I'm sorry if there's anyone else I've forgotten in this room, but thank you all for making today possible. So by way of introduction, Kameelah was born in East Palo Alto, California, and lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. She received a BA in Public Policy from Pomona College and an MA in Secondary Social Studies Education from Stanford University. So in addition to these credentials, Kameelah has been making art for a long, long time, multiple decades at this point, and has had an incredibly productive last few years with exhibitions across the globe at institutions including the KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin, the Brooklyn Museum, the Queens Museum, the Contemporary Art Gallery Vancouver, and many, many, many more. In addition to these exhibitions, Kameelah has also received numerous awards and grants for her work recently. And just to name two, she received a Creative Capital Grant in 2022 and a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2021. And on top of all this, Kameelah has found time to write an incredible Substack weekly and 4 artist books, one of which is a favorite of mine called No New Theories, which Kameelah will be talking a little bit about today. So in addition to this more formal bio I've offered, Kameelah often includes another equally important bio written a little while ago. In this bio, you'll see it on her website and in some of her artist books. And it goes, "My name is Kameelah Rasheed. I am 7 years old and I go to flood school. 7 years old is very young, but I like to read, write, and do art. I live in East Palo Alto. I'm in the 2nd grade. I'm a good reader." And I wanted to include this other earlier bio because I think together with Kameelah's rich practice now and her thinking about reading, writing, and art then, these two things kind of encapsulate key aspects of Kameelah's practice: a lifelong interest in learning through reading, writing, and making, and an interest in the ways that language about oneself and about the world stays the same and shifts over time. The way that we can return to various texts and ways of understanding ourselves and the world and create a kind of exciting friction between the then and the now and what's to come. So in the next hour, Kameelah is going to give a little bit of a lecture about her work and tell you more about her interest in language, writing, and abstraction, some of the themes of the exhibition. And then I'm going to jump back on stage and lead a Q&A. Kameelah and I will be in conversation, and then you in the audience are welcome to join us. So please give me a hand in welcoming Kameelah. And
All righty. Thank you so much, Grace, for the introduction, and thank you to the entire team here at AIC. During the time that I was installing and preparing for the show, there are several things that were happening in life and professional areas, and the team was just amazing in making sure that everything came together seamlessly. So I just want to say thank you. It's been an amazing opportunity to be here at this museum, this institution, and I am I'm just deeply humbled by this opportunity, and sad that it's going to end in January, but very grateful for the time that I had. So I'm gonna get started, and I get a little fidgety, so I will get up at some point to move around, but I'll start in a seating position. And I start most conversations that I have with Emily Dickinson. In a lot of ways, a lot of my art influences are actually from poets and their letters that they write to one another, some of the ephemera or marginalia, and some of their existing poems. And so one set of letters that has been very influential in how I think about my art practice and how I think about sort of my existence in the world is this letter between Emily Dickinson and Thomas Higginson, who was the editor of The Atlantic. And at the time, she was getting advice from him about her writing practice, trying to figure out what she needed to do, and so she was going back and forth with these letters. So I'm gonna read my favorite one, and then I'm gonna read my second favorite one. So the first one here reads, "Dear friend, are these more orderly? I thank you for the truth. I had no monarch in my life and cannot rule myself. And when I try to organize, my little force explodes and leaves me bare and charred. I think you called me wayward. Will you help me improve?" And I love this letter so much because basically Emily Dickinson was wayward in her writing practice. She wanted to use punctuation the way she wanted to. She wanted to use the compositional fill of the page in the way that she wanted to. And so this notion of waywardness and discipline is really important to her practice, but also to mine, of sort of embracing a waywardness and sort of asking this cheeky question of, will you help me improve, when neither of us have any interest in improving. We want to be able to be wayward in our practice. And I definitely don't think Saidiya Hartman was thinking about Emily Dickinson, and Emily Dickinson wasn't thinking about Saidiya Hartman in terms of waywardness, but there's a deep connection in the ways that Saidiya Hartman talks about waywardness and how I think about how Emily Dickinson talks about waywardness in refusing a monarch in her life. The second letter, which is an earlier excerpt from another letter, reads, "You think my gait spasmodic. I'm in danger, sir. You think me uncontrolled. I have no tribunal." And so you'll see this repetition in her work of her constantly talking about not having a monarch, not having a tribunal, which I translate to sort of a defiance of canon, a defiance of form, a defiance of disciplinary boundaries. So you'll see Clarice Lispector a lot in this presentation because I've been going through her work and trying to swim through it and wade through it. And one excerpt that's also really important for how I think about my work and how these presentations go is an excerpt that someone else brought to my attention. And it reads, "I want to write to you like someone learning." I added a note here, and I want to speak to you like someone learning. So all of my presentations are literally an opportunity for me to externalize and to speak to everyone, but in no ways are these definitive statements. This is an articulation of a learning process. And with that being said, with the exception of grant season, which is when you have to decide on an actual form, I identify as a learner. During grant season, I'm an installation-based artist working across many different fields, but when I'm not trying to explain or put myself into a category, I identify as a learner. And that disposition is really organized around an insistence that my work is not about making statements, that my work is not about closing off meaning, but it's an open, dynamic set of work that is really trying to get at what does it mean to learn, what does it mean to invite other people into that learning process, and what does it mean to sort of embrace an inefficiency, that we're not trying to get from point A to point Z the quickest route, we're taking the most interesting route, which includes a series of tangents. And so in thinking about the show that is up now, which is a really exciting show to produce at the same time that I was producing a show in Berlin, the show in Berlin is full of like Latin letters and texts. The show here at AIC has almost none of that. And so it was a very interesting process for me to be working on these shows in parallel. But what is most important and is fully present in both of those shows is an interest in sort of the life cycles of written language. Of course I like reading, of course I like writing, but what I'm most interested in is how a text of written language changes over time, either in its form, either in its container, either in its relationship to the reader, but I'm interested in how a text, a written language, is dynamic and not static. And so there are three examples here. The first example is an excerpt of my dad's archive of religious notes from the 1980s. And these notes included excerpts of the Quran that he cut out, and then typewritten elements as well, and his own handwriting. And the way that he organized his practice in terms of learning as the sort of palimpsest of information building on top of each other implicitly became the way that I started to think about my own practice. So right next to that is an excerpt from the book that Grace mentioned, No New Theories. It was a book that was published in 2018. I took the book home, I opened it and realized there were several errors, freaked out, tried to get the books pulled off of every shelf and tried to contact every person who had purchased it to send them an apology email before actually just trying to settle into the reality that writing is an active, dynamic process full of revision, and that I could actually publicly revise instead of hiding the process. So this excerpt here is of the interview that was in the previous edition that was edited through my annotations and footnotes from the person who was interviewing me, Jessica Lynn. And then finally, this last image here is from an ongoing project where I found the compositional field of a word processor to be limiting. So I started to write this layered essay on a wall by basically projecting some text, writing directly with and on the projections, and then also including other elements so that I could write more spatially. And part of this interest in thinking about life cycles is because I think secretly I want to still be an ecologist. And so I'm really interested in sort of the livity or livingness of everything, not just humans and other animals, but in the livingness of text and language itself. And so this is an excerpt from a book called The Life Cycle of African American Literature, and it's a text that sort of speaks through how things become part of archives, how they are collected, and I was really fascinated by this image, which goes creation, capture, storage, use, disposal. And so the question I'm most interested in is what would happen if a text or other written language never went past the stage of creation. It was never captured in a final solid form, but basically kind of stayed wet over time, that we could always go back, touch it, move things around, add it. What would it look like for us to stay in that stage of creation? And so one of the things that I want to, you'll see this slide several times, is from Alexis Pauline Gumbs' book, M-Archive. And there's a very small section, I think this is in the introduction if I remember correctly, where she writes, consider this text an experiment, an index, an oracle, an archive. Let this text be as alive as you are alive might be enough. And so this notion of text and written language being alive is not something I'm thinking about metaphorically. I'm thinking about it in a very serious way. That language, written language, is alive, that it forms relationships with other letters, it forms relationships with other texts, it forms relationships with other shapes. And I'm really interested in the livity or livingness of written language and what happens when we freeze things too much in amber. And so I'm gonna, one thing that is important for me to note is I actually do not enjoy talking about my work. I like to talk around my work and talk about all the references to my work. And so today I'm challenging myself. I'm gonna talk more directly at my work through this question of what is writing. And everything that comes after this slide is part of this very long essay that I have still not finished about my understandings of what writing is across species and across realms. So the first place, to give myself a little bit of license in terms of how I define what writing is, this is an excerpt from Clarice Lispector, again, Agua Viva, and she writes, but what is a window if not the air framed by right angles? Likewise, I would like to ask, but what is written language if not language framed by the right context? And so I'm giving myself a lot of latitude in the way that I'm thinking about this, because I think that writing shows up in a lot of different ways that we don't always accept or imagine as forms of writing, but that I would like to include in this category as methods of mark making that are information that are not necessarily intended for perfect comprehension, but they are still sharing information. So there are 4 categories I'm going to go through. The first is going to be thinking about writing as a form of approximation. So again, Clarice Lispector is all up and through this. Very much love her writing as sort of a way to frame my own relationship to writing. And so there's one particular way that she talks about writing in the language of bait. She says, so writing is the method of using the word as bait. The word fishing for whatever is not word. And I remember reading this over and over, and I'm like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? What do you mean? And I started sort of bouncing back to another text. And this is from a book that explores the relationship between Ifa and West African Sufism. And in this excerpt here, there's a Tijani Sufi scholar who is talking about what writing is. And he writes, writing is one thing and knowledge is another. Writing is the photographing of knowledge, but it is not knowledge itself. Knowledge is a light which is within man. It is the heritage of all ancestors knew and have transmitted to us as seed, just as the mature baobab is contained in its seed. And so if we were to bounce back to this one here, I think the thread or the connective tissue for both of these is this idea that when we are writing, we're trying to get close to something. We're writing so that we can get close to the thing that we experience, or so that the thing that someone else experienced. But the writing itself is not the experience. It is like a Xerox of the experience. It is a drawing of the experience, but it is not the experience itself. And I think about this in relation to this excerpt here around writing being a photograph of knowledge and sort of surrendering to the reality that when I write, I'm yearning towards some type of tactile, haptic engagement with the thing that I experience, but what I'm communicating to others will never be that haptic. It is just a few steps behind that. It is a representation, but it is not the experience itself. And so with that being said, I want to sort of jump into writing as quantum poetics, which is language from Amy Carazano from 2011, and then also thinking about this in the context of morphology. And so Grace was very clear that I have my time. I'm going to respect my time. And so there will be a point if I reach my 30 minutes that I cut things off and we'll chat afterwards. But this part feels like very important in terms of trying to ground some ideas that I've been having around writing as a process of building up layers. So when I say something in relation to quantum physics, or I say something in relation to geology, I'm thinking very specifically about this residency that I did at University of Washington earlier this year. And it was in April, and I remember many things were happening, but I was very excited for this 1 week because I was promised that I would be able to go into a quantum physicist lab and play with things, and that I would get to hang out with geologists and play with things. And so the residency was for me to play with layers. That was my interest. I wanted to understand layers in the context of quantum physics and in the context of geology. And so I want to share two things that I learned through this process that are influential for how I think about writing. The first, the image on the right side, is an image of two thin layers of graphene that are stacked on top of each other. A couple of years ago, a series of scientists figured out that when you stack these two layers at different distances, at different angles, in different ways, it produces different qualities. And so they figured out this magic angle that when you twisted at this magic angle, it allowed for superconductivity. And so this opened up a lot for me to sort of think about this process of how we organize layers in terms of like quantum physics and how that extends to writing. That writing for me is not about sequence as much as it is about building up layers and playing with opacities, playing with visibility, playing with spacing to articulate meaning. The image on the left is of core samples. Geologists take core samples to understand the history of the Earth. And oftentimes the core samples will produce information either in terms of sort of artifacted insects. There might be sawdust as an indicator that there was a sawdust production in the area, but they are their own sort of language. They are a history of the Earth. And so I started to think about this in terms of writing. How do I write through a context of revision where I'm building up layers on top of one another versus spreading them out for sequence? That I don't want to write an extra chapter, but I want that chapter to sit on top of the previous chapter, so there's clear relation of overlapping, there's clear relation of spatiality. And I also want to bring y'all to this book called Black Gathering by Sarajean. And this is a text that talks about sort of the poetics of Black Gathering. And there's a really beautiful section here where she is speaking about Amy's idea of quantum poetics. And she goes on to say, this is Amy's definition, quantum poetics investigates how physical reality is assumed, imagine, and test it through language as discernible and indiscernible scales of space-time. Those are a lot of words, and if you didn't read the paragraph before, it may not make a lot of sense. But the thing that I want to emphasize here is this insistence that when we write, we are not only engaging with the page as substrate in our hand as the sort of mechanism to make writing, we're also dealing with sort of quantum physics and dealing with what goes where and how the location of language in a metaphorical or in a literal way impacts meaning. So how we space things out, how we layer things, how we create relationships into her language above, how we create galaxies through our writing. And so I'm going to say this again, let this text be as alive as you are alive, from Alexis. This is a piece of work that I made in 2019, 2020, and oftentimes I will make text-based work and literally not have a firm idea of what I'm trying to say until there are later points where things sort of like surface that help me make sense of it. And this is just a piece that reads, the page held vibrating structures that blurted out the word. And at the time that I made this, I felt like very strongly that this needed to be made, but I wasn't connecting all the dots as to why the language of vibrating structures or blurting was important. And I quickly realized that now the importance of this was, again, thinking about the writing process as a living, active, dynamic process where you are trying to write on a page that is vibrating and words are jumping off of the substrate onto you as the reader. Which made it very exciting to come across this excerpt from Pope L, where he talks about his work, Skin Sets, and he writes, I always use a substrate or background surface when making skin sets. What if I did not? Written language requires a surface to be accessible, legible. What if the space of writing could be made up of many, many surfaces constantly in flux? What would writing look like in a space like this? In the activity of reading, how would it be accomplished? And I love the framing of his definition or description of writing and his sort of question around reading, because what it sort of surfaces for me is this idea that what if we are to read something on a page that was constantly moving, where meaning was not fixed, where literally the page is vibrating in response to its desire to be active and dynamic? And so this is from the book No New Theories that I had mentioned before. And I'm showing this image because I think that had I just gone through and just written the revisions to the interview, it would have been a very different engagement than if I had actually made these clear. So again, this notion of building up layers versus sequence in a sort of longitudinal way as meaning making. I'm going to skip past that. I'll point to this. This is from the show in Berlin currently, and I'm mentioning this because I think, again, just to note my relationship to layering, this is a pre-existing work with a piece of glass on top that is annotated, and then the lighting is strategically designed in order to ensure that there's sort of a doubling and tripling of the language and that the reader can see how the palimpsest sort of forms. Which brings us to our work at AIC. So for folks who have seen the video work already, what's important for me to emphasize about this video work is that I am not a video person. Literally in 2021, I was like, oh, I should make a video. And as I usually do when I have like a spark of like excitement, which is every day, I'm like, oh yeah, I'll just learn how to do it. So I remember sitting down and I was like, oh, I'll look at some tutorials. I remember having been in like a short class at one point, but I was like, none of this is really clicking. And so I started playing in Premiere Pro, which is the image to the right, and I started thinking about making video work as sculptural practice. How do I layer things in a particular way? How do I play with layering over time to produce elements of an image and elements of writing? And so I wasn't as concerned about sequencing, but I will, for example, in a 30-second sort of piece of the video, I'll stack 52 layers. And that is not maximalism for maximalism's just because, but it is really about an interest in building up a sense of density and a sense of palimpsest and a sense of relationality that I don't think would be achieved if I just sequenced them individually. And this also brings us to some of the other work in the show. I'm not showing a lot of the images from the show because you should just go see the show, and I don't want to ruin it for you. But these are a few images of the painting / photograph / mixed media works in the show. And I'm showing these also because these works would not make sense without a sort of certain attention to layering. And so in terms of layering, a lot of what happened here is that I started with a piece of photosensitive paper. I layered things in terms of materials, in terms of chemicals, in terms of lighting, in terms of a range of other things. And then after that, also used my body as another method to create layers. So rowing my body literally across these pieces to create impressions, to create another layer of meaning and another layer of language. I'm gonna move past my face quickly. I think this is sort of like the ending point here in terms of thinking about one other way that I'm thinking about writing. And it's, all of these are exciting for me, but this is one of the more exciting ones because I think that a lot of times writing is assumed to be a very individualistic practice. And for me, I've never written anything by myself consciously or unconsciously. I'm always pulling from somewhere, whether it's from a dream, whether it's from like an ancestor, whether it's from like a bug that crawls across a sheet of paper that inspires me. I'm always writing in collaboration. And so in thinking about this, I immediately went to the artist Beverly Buchanan. For folks who don't know her work, she worked a lot in the realm of like what we would call land art now. And this particular piece is from marsh ruins. It was a large mound that she produced in Georgia at the location that was fabled to be the Igbo Landing, where it is believed that enslaved Igbo folks either flew off to freedom or walked into the water as a form of mass suicide. And so she built this structure here, and from the book Marsh Ruins by Amelia Groom, it didn't seem like she left behind any particular care reminders. And I think the poetry of that is sort of thinking about an implicit desire for collaboration. And so this is from Amelia Groom's Marsh Ruins. And it reads, Buchanan referred to the work as an environmental sculpture. Part of what this meant was that the shifting rhythms of light, season, weather, and climate would determine how it appeared at any point in time. Making sculpture environmentally also implied a foregrounding of material vulnerability. And that's the word I think I'm most interested in, material vulnerability. The marsh ruins are continually decomposing through their ongoing exposure to sun, salt, heat, humidity, storms, tides, and currents, not to mention the area's increasingly extreme occurrences of hurricanes and flooding. There are also material additions and subtractions brought on by the local birds, plants, insects, crabs, and fish. And then there's gravity. And I think the importance of this for me is that the thing that Beverly Buchanan created, possibly individually, of course with the support of other people, became this interspecies collaborative project, that she as a human built this with her hands, and that other organisms, other climatic features sort of emanated and revised this work for her. And I think even though one might not consider this as writing, I very much consider this as writing. The rock becomes this surface, a substrate, an interface for interaction with other sort of processes. And this brings me to Banu Kapel's work. This is from a book sorry, the citation's wrong, my bad. This is from a book called Schizophrene by Banu Kapel. And she sort of describes the writing of the book as this unintentional interspecies collaboration. And she writes, toward the end of this project, I felt the great strength of the page, its ability as a fibrous surface to deflect the point of my pen. Like literally the words won't sit still, which makes me think about the vibration we mentioned before. The paper and then the screen is weirdly reflective, repelling the ink or the touch. On the night I knew my book had failed, I threw it in the form of a notebook, a handwritten final draft, into the garden of my house in Colorado. Christmas Eve, 2007. It snowed in that winter and into the spring. Before the weather turned truly warm, I retrieved my notes and began to write again from the fragments, the phrases and lines still legible on the warped, decayed, but curiously rigid pages. And again, these unintentional sort of interspecies collaborations are again really beautiful to me to sort of think about a writing practice that is not fully dependent on some moment of human inspiration, but is sometimes dependent on an accidental moment, a moment of repulsion with your own work that forces you to unintentionally look for other routes and methods of writing. And I'll end with this before I really end. And I'm looking very much at time. I'm very proud of myself, actually. What I will just mention here is again from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and you can sort of notice my citational practice sort of like orbits around a few writers at this moment, but this is from M Archive, and the reason why I'm mentioning this is because she has this very clear language around an ancestrally co-written text. And I love this language because I think, again, it's a reminder that we write in collaboration with species, we write in collaborations with ancestors, I write in collaboration with my lucid dreams, but really this notion that writing is not sort of restrained to one realm or plane of existence, nor is it sort of durationally or temporally bound to those who are living now. So I'm gonna end with this note about writing as spiritual practice and labor, mostly because it's an area that I don't talk about as much as I should, just because I think that every time I talk about writing as spiritual practice, people are like, oh, that's so woo-woo, just like get to the stuff. And I'm like, but the stuff is my spiritual practice. The stuff is my spiritual labor. And so the place that I very much go to for that is looking at this very well-known document that I remember learning about as a very young kid in Islamic study classes, but then forgetting until I read a paper a couple of years ago. And this is the Balawi Journal, or diary, or document. It was a document written by an enslaved African, possibly of Fulani descent, who wrote this like 13-page Arabic manuscript, which scholars have been able to translate, except for 5 pages in the middle. And a lot of folks have just been like, I guess there's nothing there. And there's this really interesting moment of like, what happens when written language is untranslatable? How do we relate to it? And so in part of my ways that I think about my own spiritual practice and labor is not trying to make everything comprehensible. Sometimes our relationship to written language is not one of comprehension. Sometimes it's one of like filling. Sometimes it's one of being moved without the language to explain how you're being moved. And so this is from Ashton Crawley's essay, That There Might Be Black Thought, Nothing Music in the Hammond B3 from 2013, or 2016, excuse me. And in thinking about this Balawi document, he is really pushing back against the idea of nothingness being without information. Nothingness, as he argues, is the presence of information that you don't have access to. But it does not mean nothing is there. And so when I think about abstraction, this notion that abstraction is without something, I'm very interested in the meaning that is held through abstraction, through non-readability. And so Ashton Crawley writes, to write that which emerges as incomprehensible is to write non-readability into the text, to write the necessity to think a different relation to objects, objects that are supposed to be easily captured as flesh on mediums, battus, and skiffs, to write the unasked question of being into the text by making markings that do not appear to the reader as readable. Balawi's document writes onto the page the question of being. What is this? And what of the one who scripted such irreducible incomprehension? And so I want to end on this note of like embracing incomprehension, not as like a failure, but as a sort of the nature of what it means to be alive in the world. And I'll just put up, and we can just leave up this slide, which is from Harriet Mullen's essay, African Signs and Spirit Writing, where she encourages us to sort of think about written language, not only for what it communicates under a capitalist environment, like we're trying to just quickly extract information, but to think about the actual graphic qualities of language, to think about the spatial organization of language as just as important as what you may be able to extract from it in terms of perfect understanding. And I'll end there, and Grace and I are gonna chat.
Thank you so much for that really generous introduction to your practices and your references. And I think for visitors who haven't seen the exhibition, you've just provided such a wonderful context for what it is that they will see. And yeah, thank you so much for that. And to that end, to connect this all with the exhibition, I wanted to ask you a question. It's not quite an elephant in the room, but you've talked so much about writing and language, and when people enter the show, as you mentioned, they won't find a lot of that. And you and I have had several conversations about what it means to continue to be committed to writing and language when you no longer have the words to express something, and that was something that I think we both talked about a lot this year as you were making this work. So I'm wondering, thank you for reading my mind and putting this work up, but I'm wondering if we could talk through some of the strategies you used and how you're seeing the continuation of language and writing in these works.
Yeah. And so I thank you. Also, I'm very proud of myself for keeping time. I never keep time, like literally never.
Also,
I
wasn't like a taskmaster about it. I wanted you to go on for as long as you want.
Not Grace was not the taskmaster, but I know that whenever I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna give a 30-minute talk and it's like 2 hours, and so I was just very proud of myself that I like stuck to it. So no, Grace has been amazing. Grace has provided all the grace. So yes, to this question around writing and my relationship to it, particularly for this show. There are a couple of things. So I want to reframe that. When I think about writing, I think about it as mark making that includes information, right? And that information may not always be decipherable. And at the time, I was very focused on Latin letters. So I usually engage with Latin letters or Arabic letters in my practice. And there was a point very clearly this year where many things were happening personally and professionally where I literally lost language, meaning that I didn't have Latin letters to write or Arabic letters to write that could convey what I was feeling. And so in that situation, I had to figure out how was I going to communicate without using those letters, because I had found them to not be the best method for what I was going through and feeling and trying to make sense of. And so when it came to this work, this was very much a large experiment. I don't work in this way at all. I don't make photographs and paintings in this way. I just don't do this. And so part of the beautiful risk and challenge about this show was literally having the trust of the institution, having the trust of Grace to say, I want to write something, but we don't know what the writing is going to look like on the other side, because I'm engaging with a chemical and biological process that is living and has its own sort of hopes and wishes. And so there was a moment right before they were shipped where I was completely annoyed and frustrated and repulsed by the work because it felt so unfamiliar to me. I've been used to like writing since I was a little kid. I've been used to using my letters, and I had lost them, and I had to figure out another way to communicate. And that way was actually trying to use sort of like the poetry of like fluid dynamics, which is how liquids and fluids move across a substrate as a sort of language. And so I was using the process of taking this paper, which was very reactive and responsive, as a sort of a moment to like slow down to think about a substrate that is reactive to my human touch. Then I was dipping it in and out of chemicals. I was slathering it with other things. I was literally rolling my body against it. And one of the pieces of writing that we shared for this show was me talking about this process of me trying to rub my body against a substrate to release language. And that's how it felt most of the year, of like literally trying to use whatever part of my body I could, pretty much other than my fingers, to write something to like release language from a substrate. And so the result of this is works that are using my human body weight, human body oils to produce something that is writing, but doesn't necessarily show up as Latin letters or Arabic letters.
What I think was really beautiful about what happened because of that journey is we started with these texts that you're reading and that you referenced in this talk, and so much of what you said, I think, becomes visible in these works, this interest in writing staying wet, or, you know, all of these like interspecies communications, all the various things can lead to a conversation, written or otherwise, ends up really revealing itself through the works. And I'm also wondering, also I should say that we can totally open this if anyone has questions. I'm gonna ask Kameelah one more thing, and then I'll open it up to everyone else. You mentioned your interest in core samples and geology, and I think that I can see that in how you're working with layers and collage, and I'm wondering if you were actively working with geology and the thinking as you were making these works too.
Yeah, I feel like 2023 was a year where a lot of the stuff that I intuitively did as like a kid came back in my artist practice. So geology and basic ecology was a large part of my childhood. I grew up in East Palo Alto, which is near a marsh. And so part of like our school field trips, you would go to a marsh, you would eat pickleweed, you would learn about the ecology of the area, you would dig in the dirt, you would go to Coyote Point, you would find owl pellets, which is like owl poop. You would dissect the owl pellets to figure out what it ate. And so there's been a long sort of engagement with the natural world in my earlier sort of like living. And I was always fascinated by the idea that you could dig and then there would be something else and you could keep digging and there would be something else, you could just keep digging. And that was like a large fascination of mine as a young person. I remember my 4 brothers and I, like my parents didn't have to buy us toys because we would sit outside in dirt and just like dig for hours. And so I think that coming back to the work in this year, what was really interesting was to recognize how much I needed a more tactile and fully embodied art making practice. I was doing a lot of stuff just with my hands or just with my eyes in terms of looking at a screen and moving things around, and I actually needed something that implicated my entire body. And so geology became this really interesting language for me in terms of thinking about deep time, in terms of like how much time have things been happening on the earth and how we measure that, and then also trying to think about deep time in my own practice. How much further can I dig, and I'll put up this slide, back into my own self in order to do sort of a call and response to call forth those things. I just think geology is fascinating at like a pure like dorky level, but I also think it gives us a lot of information for sort of a language of writing and the ways that the earth writes itself, the way that we write on the earth, whether it's from us walking and leaving marks, whether it's from a range of other sort of impressions that are made on the earth by our human presence and vice versa. I think geology offers like a really beautiful language and sort of like substrate to consider that.
What I love about what you've said is combining writing and geology and also arriving at a kind of playfulness, right? And how you ended up back at these, through this kind of excavation process, ended up back at these childhood games and ways of playing with material as a way to kind of find your way back into writing.
Yeah, I think as I have tried to write this essay, I feel like I've been writing this one essay about writing, which is since 2019, I just haven't been able to dislodge it, and I like recently turned it into like a browser-based project, so I was like, maybe what it needs is hypertext.
Can you talk about that browser-based project a little bit?
Yes, I can talk about this browser-based project. So this is also going back to my childhood because I had a really lovely childhood. Now that I sit and think about it, it's a very, very very layered childhood. So even though you don't realize your family is poor until you get older, but my parents were very good about providing a wealth of opportunities. And one of them was that there was a program called Plugged In, which you could be like a 10 to like 14-year-old, I think, and they would just teach you how to code and do design. So I would go and like make web pages for like local companies because we were in Silicon Valley, and I developed this deep interest in like browser-based experiences, started coding a lot, and I still do a lot of this now. And so the browser-based project is my attempt to write an essay that is not in printed form, but in a browser to allow for interactivity. So the idea that if you're reading something, you can click a link that will send you somewhere else, or you can hear my voice saying a part that I couldn't actually get into written language, but I can articulate verbally, or there's a point where there's a shift in tone, and that's sort of signaled by something other than a period that tells you to go next. And so I'm trying to basically find different interfaces that allow a different type of interactivity when it comes to writing that's not just restrained to text on the page, you read it and you move on, but how can we actually play with time and density by using the browser as like this space for hypertext, but like hyper connectivity and relationality, which I think is just hard when you're with a page, like, but you can click something and move things around on a browser.
Right, so kind of continuing our interest in making writing sculptural and making abstraction a kind of writing. I actually thought you were going to mention, I was on your website recently and saw your project where you're asking other people for words.
So here's the problem, Grace, is that I do things and I forget that I do them. Yes, there is a project that I have right now, and they're basically called like lo-fi playthings, which is me coding small little games, basically using like light JavaScript and a few other things. But this one is like a very, very basic one, which is powered by just a little bit of JavaScript, where people send me words over a course of a month, And then I give myself 10 days, which I didn't realize I needed 10 days, so it's due tomorrow, to write something using just what is given to me. And so sometimes that comes out of me basically creating a score or a sequence for myself and how I'm writing it. And so right now I have like 338 words that I need to put into writing. I have like 160 more words to integrate into this final piece of writing before it goes live tomorrow. But I really like the idea of a writing practice that is not dependent on my inspiration or my sort of like context, but that I'm getting words in different languages, I'm getting words that I've never seen before, and I'm learning a lot and then trying to piece this into a narrative and then offering it back. So it's called Gift Me a Word. They gift me a word, and then I gift them some type of like whole using all the words that have been collected across a period of time.
So I'm just asking in a self-interested way. The people
No,
who
you're
have
fine.
gifted you words, will
They
we
will-
get? Okay, I've been.
Yes, they will.
I've been
They
sliding
will.
you words now,
Tomorrow,
then.
they will open that same page where they gifted me things, and they will see the piece of writing that includes the 338 words that were gifted to me. So 338 people or entries were gifted to me, and I want to gift something back.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you for talking through
course.
that. And that was just my own curiosity. I'm wondering if, before we turn it over to the audience, if you could also talk a little bit about the importance of the architectural invention that's in the exhibition. So
Yeah.
if you've been in the space, you'll see that the gallery is a little bit smaller than normal because we've built a wall that has some videos embedded in it and a window that looks back onto some photographs from your
Yeah.
childhood. So could you talk a little bit about the importance of that for you?
Absolutely. So as Grace mentioned, when you walk in to your left, there's a black wall that has 3 videos that are embedded into the wall. And then there's like a cutout. And in that cutout, there's vinyl, and then there's an image on top of it. And when we originally were thinking about the show, we were thinking a lot about language, of course, but how language is often considered to be the thing on a page, but also how architecture provides a sort of language or a mode of communication. And so I kept thinking about this window from my childhood home. We were displaced in 1998, and the first wave of displacement and gentrification in the Bay Area. And as a result of that, ended up staying with family that weren't very nice for about a decade, and that causes its own thing. But in the cutout, the things that I was really interested in was sort of thinking about being a young person and looking out this window onto my siblings, onto my city of East Palo Alto, and wanting to recreate sort of one space that felt very safe and comforting to me. And as you look into the window, you'll see one main thing, which is a picture of my eldest brother pointing at a picture of himself. And it's a picture that I hold really dear to me because I think that part of growing up and learning and making sense of things is not only being able to recognize the world, but being able to come home or recognize yourself. And so I wanted to include an image that was sort of grounding for me in terms of my own family's history, but I also wanted to sort of cite in a way, this architectural moment, which is this window that would look out of onto a lemon tree and sort of watch my brothers outside when they were allowed to be outside because I was punished for doing something, being able to look at them out of that window and sort of thinking about sort of the architectures that I have encountered and how that sort of impacted my relationship to language. And I guess one last part I'll say to that is that I, as a young person, grew up in a house that was very language forward, and that we had early computers. My parents loved collecting books and paper. There were random science textbooks from my dad's pharmacy school days, and so I just sort of grew up in an environment that was very dense with language, and part of my interest is matching that density of my experience in the ways that I sort of layer, in the ways that I sort of organize architectural spaces to represent that density. So you'll see a graphic that is dense and has a range of sort of intersecting mark making.
Thank you. Yeah, I love seeing how your recounting of your childhood connects with the things you found through your work with geology. It all kind of ends up tying back. And I think when we spoke about this yesterday, you used the incredible phrase of sampling from one's own subconscious.
Oh, I did say that.
Yeah,
I did say that.
as an approach and a style.
Should I say more about that?
Yes, please.
Okay, cool. And then, yes, what I will say about that is I am not a musician, but I actually very much love music in, it feels like a silly statement, like I love music, but I like sort of studying music, and my best friend in South Africa is a musician, also the person, Tando, who did the score for the video, and we often talk about sampling, and I kept thinking about wanting to figure out sampling in relation to someone being a person, right? Like, how do you sample oneself? And so the image that's up on the screen now actually works really well, because the way that I think about sampling from your unconscious or sampling from oneself is sort of returning back to oneself to find something that you either created or thought about in the past and bringing it back to the surface. So that's one mode of self-sampling. In this show that we have here, there is a piece of text and a video that is my handwriting at 7 years old from a book that I wrote to my mom. And so that is a form of self-sampling. I'm going back to a former version of myself and bringing it into the present. The other form of sampling that I'm really interested in is sampling the unconscious, which is an attempt by me in forms of meditation and sort of lucid writing, which is to try to write from a place of non-narrative, to sit and try to write something without the goal being I'm going to write a perfect story, but to sit and just write without a goal being present. And the sampling comes from the things that are able to populate when you're not trying to efficiently get to a goal. And so sampling the language from music, of course, is important, but I think the most important thing is how you take the thing from elsewhere within you and you sort of braid it into a context of the present and the future in a way that is self-citational, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Thank you.
Of course.
All right. Does anyone have questions? Yes. Hi. You might, or I think.
Thank you, Miguel.
Yes, Miguel's on it.
Salam alaikum.
Like Wasam.
Since you're from the hotbed of technology, this is a technology-related question.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on how AI has affected art and communication in general, and language and words in specific?
Well, talk about the big question at the beginning. So first of all, what I would like to say is I have like 3,000 hours of thoughts, which I'm going to reduce to about 45 seconds, which is that as a child of Silicon Valley, we had access to all this like emerging technology because different organizations would be like, hey, kids, try this thing out. And so I've been very aware of the relationship between like labor and technology, and very interested in questions around data and surveillance. And so the way that I have thought often about machine learning in AI is that any tool created by humans has the result or possibility or risk of being exploited and misused by humans. So that's the first response. The second part of that is that I think I did a short fellowship with Google back in 2022 around machine learning, where they invite artists just to play with these different tools. And I played with Midjourney for like 6 months to a year, and the result was not my sense of like excitement about machine learning. The result of that was like, wow, humans are amazing because no machine can ever produce the depth of what a human can produce. Machine learning, when it comes to image generation and text generation, is completely dependent on us as inputs. So whatever we input into the machine is what is produced. It is a collage of what we've created. And so I think that when people are pursuing machine learning to create some like novel idea or novel object or novel text, I actually don't think that is what machine learning is for. I think that machine learning becomes this way for us to actually make sense of what people are saying and doing, and what has become popularized or what has become statistically most prevalent, but I don't think about it as a place that I use to create final art pieces. I have used machine learning, particularly text generation, to play with notions of translation. So I did a project where I, similar to the one Gift Me a Word, where basically it was the beginning of the pandemic. I was doing a writing workshop. I said to folks in the workshop, give me 4 words in the chat. I went away for 37 minutes and had to write something from the words that people left in the chat. I took a video of that and then translated the location of the mouse clicks into music, and then got bored and wanted to do something else. So then I took those translations and started feeding them into Midjourney. And I was really interested in what Midjourney does in relation to poetic text, and it kind of breaks. It doesn't do well with poetic text. It does very well with like a cat walking another cat, but writing a sentence like a slice of blue moon descended from the sky doesn't know what to do with that. And so the way that I engage with machine learning is almost as a mode of intentionally feral translation, so intentionally trying to see how far you can push a machine into absurdity. But I also use it as part of sort of like a playful divination practice. So like if I get an image from Midjourney, what are the other ways that I can push that image into other forms and use it for something else? But I'm not very interested in saying I produced something from Midjourney, here's the final piece, but I am deeply interested in saying I produced something from ChatGPT or from Midjourney, and this is my sort of engagement with it as a starting point for a practice. But I just think that humans are creating beautiful things, and that machine learning can never, ever match like what it means to have a spirit and have a humanity that produces things from like the depth of human experience.
Thank you. That was a great question.
Yeah, it was a really good question. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
If you wanted to share your, I mean, it wouldn't be your personal, but a working definition of language that you find
I like how you asked this very hard question.
And just in case anyone in the back didn't hear the question, it's could Kameelah provide a working definition of language? Her personal working definition of language.
My personal working definition of language without a degree in linguistics and from my lived experience as a 38-year-old in the world. I think about language as any attempt to communicate something regardless if what is communicated is clear. So I think about language as attempt-based, if that makes sense. Language is not so much that it does a thing as much as it attempts to do a thing, which is why I think that we're constantly in arguments about language, because we recognize the failures of language to do what we actually want, which is to provide clarity and to provide solutions, and it fails at that because we're humans and language is responsive to our human engagement. I would also say that language, when it comes to interspecies context, functions really beautifully, and that what we consider to be language as humans shows up differently for something like a snail that leaves like a mucus track that has chemicals that identify who should come and sort of tag along. And so I think about language, again, attempt-based, but I think there are some modes of languaging outside of our species that are more utilitarian, if that makes sense. I think that humans do a really good job of complicating things, but I think that's sort of the nature of what makes being a human beautiful, is that we strive for a clarity that we can't actually get, and part of that striving is the living, trying to language the things that only we've experienced and trying to relay them to other people. So yeah, I think it's a spiritual labor, and I think it's an attempt-based labor, and I think that none of us have ever or will ever get it right.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
You gave me a lot to think about. We have time for one more question. Is there anyone who has that question? Yes. Oh, two. Maybe we have time for two.
Yeah.
I guess building off this first question, right? You spoke about a definition of language as something you're trying to express, but I guess I could think of myself as like a reader, right? Somebody that's reading your language. I would be curious if you have thoughts about the context of people that are now looking at your work and trying to read it, and maybe building off of comments you've just made.
The last part I did.
Just like in relation to your definition of language, how should us as readers of that think of ourselves and the context that we bring to your work?
Yeah, so I'm going to repeat it to make sure I got it. With the definition of language that I just provided, what does that mean for other folks as readers? Okay, got it, perfect. So give me a second to reduce this to a minute. 1 second. I think in the same way that I think about writing as attempt-based, I also think about reading as attempt-based. They're in parallel, right? Like you write something that tries to approximate experience. Someone else as a reader tries to read into that experience and get closer to it, right? Like we read the literature or memoirs because we want to get close or have a sense of, maybe it's just a parasocial relationship. We want to have a sense of relationality to the thing or the person we're reading about. And so when I think about reading, I'll bring up Umberto Eco, just because I think like the way that he speaks about reading makes a lot of sense to me, and he talks about this concept of inferential walks, which is this notion that as you read a text, you as the reader are going on walks. You are creating your own associative network of meaning, and part of reading is not just like picking up what's on the page, but actually filling in gaps that the writer has intentionally left or doesn't even know that they've left. So there's this notion of like a person who's inferentially walking, making their own connections, right? The second part that he talks about is something called ghost chapters. This notion that because we are going on all these inferential walks, what is happening alongside each text, even if it's not visible, is that people are creating all these ghost chapters. These chapters that sort of haunt the original. They are the annotations, they are the comments, they are the response, they are the repulsion, they are all these things. And so when I think about how a text or written language changes over time, I'm not only interested in like the author going back to change a sentence, I'm also interested in how the reader's relationship to the text changes as well. And so I think that there's an interesting dynamic between readers and writers, and that we both desire some type of like finality or stability, but we can't fulfill that promise for either person, right? I as a writer can't fulfill stability of meaning, and you as the reader can't fulfill stability of comprehension, because you grow as a person and change your understanding, and I grow as a person and may change my relationship to the text. And so I think reading is a choice to be a collaborator. It is a choice to like walk into a world and recognize that you may not walk out the same, or recognize that you may walk out frustrated because the text isn't providing the sort of reward that you hoped. But I think, again, it's attempt-based, and I think it's a tense relationship. And I think it's one of the relationships that's not confined to a page, but we're reading things all the time. And because of that, we're constantly in this effort or this attempt to do sense-making, even when the thing doesn't want to sort of hand itself over to that sense-making.
Thank you for that answer, and thank you for allowing us to be readers of your work, both through this lecture and in the exhibition. Okay, great, sorry. So I guess I will close out there with a thank you to the audience, and yeah.
We did it. Thank you.